February 5th, First Wednesday's lecture. This, as you know, is part of our Vermont Humanities Council First Wednesday's lecture series. I'd like to thank them and all of our sponsors. Happen to be the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library, Entergy Vermont, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Merrill Lynch of Brattleboro, and hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody. I'm glad that today isn't as rainy and sleety as it was on February 5th. Now that winter's behind us, we have a better day for her to tell us the fascinating story of Mr. and Mrs. Prince. First, let me give you Dr. Gerzina's vitae, which is long and distinguished as a scholar, teacher, and in the world of radio. She is chair of the English department and the Kathy Tapp Vernon Professor in Biography at Dartmouth College. She is also an honorary visiting professor at the University of Exeter and was the Fulbright Distinguished Scholar to Great Britain. At Dartmouth, Dr. Gerzina teaches courses on the novel, biography, Bloomsbury, and Black literature. She is the author of a number of books and publications, including Carrington, A Life, about the Bloomsbury figure Dora Carrington, whose life was made into a film starring Emma Thompson, Black London, about the black population of 18th century Britain, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, by the way, Frances Hodgson Burnett, The Unexpected Life of the Author of The Secret Garden, and editor of the book Black Victorians, Black Victoriana. She hosts a nationally syndicated radio program called The Book Show, which interviews authors on their recent books. Guests have included Khalid Hosseini, Philip Roth, Toni Morrison, David McCullough, Anna Quinlan, and others. If you'd like to tune into her radio show, see me after the talk, and I can give you the call letters and a link to where you can listen to past programs. She has appeared frequently as a radio guest in both England and America, as well as in several British television documentaries. In fact, next month she will appear on the PBS Tavis Smiley Show. Her most recent book, co-authored with her husband Anthony, Mr. and Mrs. Prince, How an Extraordinary 18th Century Family Moved Out of Slavery and Into Legend, was published in February and has garnered many highly praised reviews. Just last week it was reviewed in the New York Times. In an early review of the book, Jonathan Haar, author of The Lost Painting, who discussed his quest of the Caravaggio story here in 2006, wrote, "This book gives you the frisson of excitement that occurs only when you read something really, really good. It is, in its way, a suspense story with a narrative that pulls you along like a leash around your neck. But it's also much more than that. A journey of discovery so meticulously, artfully, and evocatively crafted that it immerses you completely. A book that both entertains and informs, which is indeed a rare combination." Please welcome Dr. Gerzina.
I still do hosannas in front of Jonathan Haar's books in bookstores when I see them after he wrote that nice blurb for the book. He was really very, very generous. It's very wonderful to be back here, to see so many old friends. Anthony and I lived in Guilford until 2.5 years ago and still miss it quite a bit, but discovered that it's much easier to work and live in the same place and not be climbing over the mountain in Springfield every day when you go to work in the evening. You cannot hear it? Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the princes. I'm not going to talk so much about the book itself. This is more talk about people who lived here, and it's a special thing to be able to come back to the places where these two extraordinary people lived with their families and where so many different things happened with them. So we spoke the other day in Manchester, and a lot of the story takes place in Sunderland and Manchester. So it's really very fitting to come back to where a lot of this really began. And it really began in Deerfield, and even earlier than that in some other places, but I'll go through that. What I want to do today is really just give you a sense of who they were, the lives they lived, and perhaps change a few ideas about what you think you know about the princes, or you may think you know about the princes. I'd like to start by talking about the fact that there are two tracks to this story. I have to get used to this mic. If you move 1 little centimeter, it goes off. There are two stories here. One is the legend and the truth of their lives as Anthony and I were able to find it. And the other is what this really tells us about New England and New England history and the history of black people in New England, which we found to be much more extensive than people probably realized at the time. So I will just say that this book is the result of 7 years of nearly full-time research with the two of us. So that, as my mother, who's a genealogist, always tells people, you can't sit down at a computer and expect to find things you need to know. It actually means a hands-on groveling, in our case, traveling, driving to lots and lots of places. And most things are not in libraries. So it was a really wonderful time to be watching as their story kind of unfolded over time. So I'm going to tell you first about the legend of Abijah and Lucy Prince, the way you would read about it on the internet, the things you might have read before in other publications that talked about them, and then just give you a sense of where the story starts to differ. Abijah and Lucy, in the legend, lived in Deerfield, Massachusetts, but they began with Abijah's birth in Wallingford, Connecticut around 1706. And his being taken to Northfield, Massachusetts as a young boy, probably around the age of 12, where he lived with a minister, Doolittle, Benjamin Doolittle, and his family for many, many, many years. He met Lucy, who was brought from Africa to Deerfield as a child, and where she grew up in Deerfield, and later married her. The story tells us in the legend that they were able to get a lot of the things they got through the help of good, kindly people who helped them out. That Abijah was given his freedom and some land by his owner, the Reverend Doolittle, and that later he was given his land, his 100 acres in Guilford, because someone in Deerfield, David Field, was honoring a bequest or a request made by his father to give Abijah this land. This turns out not to be true. And what we discover is that, in fact, Abijah and Lucy, almost every step of the way, were in charge of their destinies in one way or another, that they worked hard to get everything they got, and that they managed to make things happen, that things were not just given to them. So the legend begins there. It moves on after Guilford, after the death of Abijah Prince in 1791, 3. He's my fact checker as well as my husband. And that Lucy then moved to land that they owned in Sunderland, Vermont. And in Sunderland, Vermont, she found the same thing happening to her that they had found happening here, which was that people were trying to take their land from them and get them off the land. This occurred here. I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. And then it also occurred in Sunderland. The story goes that Lucy went to court 2 times, that she went to court here in order to get the land in Guilford protected for them, and that she also went to court in Sunderland. And in that case, the legend says that she went to the United States Supreme Court to argue her case to keep her land, and won. I'm not going to tell you the outcome of all those cases because it's long and involved and it's in the book, and I want to just tell you a bit more about the kind of lives they lived. So that's the legend we begin with. Now let's talk about their lives. Abijah, I'm going to leave it right here because we don't really have images of Northfield. Abijah went to Northfield about the age of 12. He spent nearly 40 years there as the only slave in that whole area. We found one other slave living in Northfield several miles away, so they may have run into each other. But you can imagine the kind of lonely life this would have been. Northfield was very small, it was very tiny. When he first got there were only a dozen or so houses laid out, and it was still under attack by the French and Indians. So that he had to have a very lonely life in a kind of isolated place, also living with a minister who wasn't always that popular. And in fact, there were some real problems while he was living there. So he was owned not only as a slave, but also owned by a man who was not always very popular in his own town, so which made things very difficult for him. But it also meant that he developed a number of skills that he could use later in life. As the only family servant, and servant was the word that everybody used, they refused to use the word slave in New England. As the only servant of the Doolittle household, he was called upon to do a number of things. He could use a gun, he could use a boat, he could ride a horse, he could do all the farm chores that one would expect, and he also helped probably around the house as needed. So we get a sense of a man who later became an entrepreneur, but he had developed all of those skills at that time. He probably also went to Deerfield fairly often because Doolittle would go there for shopping and that sort of thing. And you imagine that they would take two people and be armed when they went into town. And when he went into Deerfield, that's where he probably would have met Lucy. One of the biggest challenges was to try to find out how Lucy got here, where she came from. And of course, there's only so much you can find out about slavery. People were not listed on slave ships by the names that they had known themselves by, or by the names that they maybe adopted later, or that were foisted on them later. So you can't exactly look at a manifest and say, oh, there's Lucy Terry, and she came in on this ship from this place. That's an impossible thing to do. But what we did discover was that slavery in New England, because it was so rampant, was very much a part of the slave trade. And most of you, I think, know the slave trade, which originates in Britain and in other European countries, that takes goods manufactured in Britain, takes them to Africa, to the west coast of Africa, trades there those goods for slaves, fills up the ships, and then goes to the Americas. About 70% of the slaves taken from Africa ended up not in North America, but in the West Indies and South America. So only about 30% of the slaves taken from Africa ended up in what became the United States. Lucy probably went the route that you would imagine most of those ships took. That is, that she went down to the West Indies from Africa and then was taken up the coast. America was involved in the slave trade, but in fact, in actually not just buying slaves that were brought in on the trade, but actually originating some of it. Because we don't really think of ships going from America over to Africa, purchasing slaves and bringing them back. That's not the normal route. But in fact, there was one major slaving port in America, and that was in Rhode Island. So that of all the places you can think of in America where slaves were actually being taken, shot over and come back from, you never would think of Rhode Island. But in fact, we find that New England is implicated all over the place in slavery and the slave trade. And that was just one of the surprises we found. Another surprise was that, in fact, there were slave plantations in Connecticut. Not something that we would generally think about at all. And in fact, those slaves were put to work to grow crops to feed slaves in the West Indian plantations. So that it was a really kind of terrifying system that worked very well. This man here is named Hugh Hall. He was originally from Barbados, where his father was a very well-off man. Hugh Hall went to Harvard and settled in Boston afterwards. He became a great merchant, although he wanted really to be a minister. But at Harvard, he met a number of people who will figure in the Lucy and Abijah story. The reason I'm showing you Hugh Hall is that he, among all the things that he sold in his shop, which is where Faneuil Hall Market is today, Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall today, he was one of the biggest slave traders in the Boston area. And we are pretty certain that Hugh Hall is the way that Lucy got here. And there are some advertisements and some dates and some facts that really lead us to him. This is an ad that talks about several lively Negro men, women, boys, and girls, some of which arrived about a week ago to be sold by Hugh Hall. And we think that it was this ad, or one just like it that we found, that actually refers to Lucy coming into the United States, which was not the United States then, of course. Now, Lucy arrived not directly to Deerfield, but she got to Deerfield when she's about 10. I won't tell you how, and it took a while. But she arrived in Deerfield when she was about 10 years old. There she was taken into the home of, this is the street in Deerfield. I don't know if you know Deerfield very well, but that's the street as it looked about 150 years ago. Very bucolic. She was taken into the home, change this slide, of Ebenezer Wells and his wife Abigail. This is a very old picture. This is the way it looks today. The previous one was the way it looked when she, about the time she would have arrived. The house was later rebuilt. things burned down and were built again. So it's a little hard to say at which point she lived in which part of the house, but we do know that the early part of the house is where she probably spent most of her youth. This is the main room in the old part of the house, and this is the bed that Ebenezer Wells and his wife would share. It's also the same room that the tavern was in. This is the kitchen, and this is probably where the child Lucy spent much of her time. In those days, many of you know this, you would see that right in here, the fireplace was actually large enough to step into, and that she probably spent a great deal of time inside that fireplace, cooking, putting pies under coals to bake, keeping the fire going. One of the things I discovered in the research was that one of the leading causes of death for women at that time, women and girls, was fire, right after childbirth. So that you can imagine with those long skirts getting in and out of that fire all of the time. She probably slept in front of that fireplace. If she didn't sleep there, her other place of sleeping would have been in the attic. And the attic would have been shared with another slave named Caesar, who also lived in the house, and also with a number of soldiers who would come through as the town would be attacked and be fortified. They would house soldiers. We have another view of one of the bedrooms. This is really the main room of the house. So it was the kitchen, this room, and that was pretty much Lucy's life for the early part of her life. This room housed the Wells couple. It also had the table where you could see that they had a tavern for a few years, and Lucy would wait on tables, and then the spinning wheel, so you could see that a lot of domestic activity took place there. So this is the kind of childhood she had. She grew up in a town where, in fact, she was a slave, but she was not at all the only slave. And I have a link, I don't know if it's going to work, I may not show you until the end, but they've put together a wonderful interactive map through UMass that shows the main street of Deerfield. And one of the astounding things that you'll discover if you look at it was that something like 38% of the houses in that main street of Deerfield in the 18th century had slaves living in them. Now, we don't think about that. You know, for a long time, I think people thought Lucy was the slave living in Deerfield, was the only one. But in fact, she was part of a large group of people, a kind of community, you would even think, of slaves living there. And it was a different kind of slavery from what we might imagine, but it was no less slavery at all. So she may not have worked on a cotton plantation, but she was owned, she could be bought and sold, slaves were regularly bought and sold, parents and children were regularly separated. At the same time, she could go to church, and in fact, she had to go to church. The slaves were all, especially during the Great Awakening, when Jonathan Edwards was baptizing a lot of people, slaves were regularly baptized, and they were forced to go to church. They sat in the balcony, and they sometimes had to sit behind a curtain in the balcony. So Lucy was baptized quite young, and she was made a full member in communion of the church at that later point. So that they went to church, but they were forced to go to church. They were slaves, but they had a certain amount of freedom. They could shop in the shops. Sometimes they would bring in things that they caught when they were hunting. Sometimes they would be buying things to make bullets with and to be using for their firearms. So we know that they were hunting. We know that everybody had to be armed because there was always fear of attack, and that so they were living in a very strange kind of slavery that we don't really understand today. I think a lot of us are just trying to come to terms with what that must have been like. This is the house, excuse me, just the other room in the house, in the early house, and this was the pantry. And one of the things they would do in here would be make cheeses, turn them regularly, and store them in there. So dairy was quite a big thing in Deerfield at that time. And I'm told that this window is totally historically inaccurate, so I probably shouldn't show it, but they didn't have those diamond panes. But it is a window that is high up. When you go visit the house, you can see that window. And this is probably the door that Lucy would have stepped in and out of, going in and out of the kitchen garden, going in and out with firewood, going in and out to chat with people on the street. Now, one of the things that we know about Lucy was that she had this great gift of gab. She was smart, she was poetic, she had a great turn of phrase, And that as she lived there longer and longer, people would just come by to hear her talk. Later, after she married, people talked about how their children would go to her house just to sit by her and have her tell them stories. Well, a lot of these were probably Bible stories. She was very much a Christian at that time, and she would really entertain them. So this is how we know about her famous poem. Does anybody know the name of the poem? It's called The Bars Fight, and it commemorates a fight that took place in 1746 in a field called the Bars, right outside of Deerfield, where the French and Indians attacked a group of people who were hoeing corn in the field. They had a lookout, but the lookout wasn't able to warn them in time. And it was actually kind of a massacre. People were tomahawked, children were killed, and several families were decimated. Lucy would have been about 20 years old when this occurred, and as they brought the people in, she wrote a ballad commemorating that Bars fight, talking about who'd gotten hurt, who'd gotten killed, and what the battle was like. That poem is now pretty much known to be the first composed poem by an African American. So that if you open any anthology of African American literature today, you will see Lucy Terry and Bars Fight as the first poem listed in, even though it was not published during her lifetime. So we come to a woman who's got this great sense of excitement about language, and then we have this man who's been living in this farm. Whatever happens to Abijah? Well, we found out some interesting things about Abijah Prince. One was that when he was living in this house that was getting smaller and smaller because the Doolittles were having more and more children and more soldiers were there, and Abijah was doing all of the work, and we see that Doolittle is perhaps not keeping track of Abijah the way he used to. Abijah would be able to go out and earn some money. He would put out the town flag and be paid for that. There are various things he could do. He is a man now in his 40s who has been left to kind of isolate in this place all of these years with a master who is not necessarily that kind to him. So what does he do? He joined the army, and still as a slave, he hitched up and went off and fought in several battles in the French and Indian Wars. And when he earned that money, he came back, and we think that that's how he managed to engineer his freedom. This is a shop in Deerfield owned by Elijah Williams, and I think a lot of you know about the Williams family. The founding family of Williams College and a number of other people, and they were known as the River Gods because they owned so many businesses and they were involved in politics. Elijah Williams' shop and house were right across the street from the Wells house where Lucy lived, and Abijah served under Elijah Williams in the service. So there became a long relationship with Elijah that helped him a long way, and I won't go into the long convoluted story about that, but Abijah and Elijah, I like that their names rhyme, ended up having a kind of more like a mentor relationship. I would not call them friends. I think that would have been a step too far for a man in Elijah's time and place. But this shop would be right there, and we know that Abijah worked for Elijah after the war. One day, when we were about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years into the research, Anthony had gone to the Springfield Courthouse in Springfield, Massachusetts, looking through the land records in the basement, and it's a long story about how he got there and why he was looking there. But he was not looking for anything other than land records, and he came out with this document that still floors us. And for those of you who can't see it, I'll read it to you, because it's a little out of focus perhaps for you. Know all men by these presents that I, Aaron Burt, of Northfield in the county of Hampshire and province of Massachusetts Bay in New England, weaver, for sundry goods, considerations, me hereunto moving, have manumitted, released, and forever discharged my Negro man servant and slave named Abijah alias Prince from any further service or servitude. And this goes on. What he had discovered was Abijah Prince's manumission. It is so hard to find the papers that free a slave, and to have suddenly come across this in the basement of Springfield, Massachusetts, was astonishing. But most astonishing was that we'd never heard of this man, Aaron Burt. We had freed Abijah. So that was part of the mystery of this detective story that we were beginning to piece together, was who was this man? How could he possibly have come to free Abijah? What did this mean in terms of Abijah's life? Well, what it meant was that Abijah was now free to do quite a lot of things in his life. That is, he was free to go where he wanted and work where he wanted, and to maybe have his own money and use it in ways that we might not have understood. One of the things that Abijah did that is so wonderful was begin to travel around, and he lived in Northampton for a time. He lived near South Hadley. He lived in Western Mass, and within what Anthony dubbed, I think in response to the River Gods idea, he started calling it the Negro Network. And we discovered that, in fact, there were a number of free black people living in the area, many of whom owned land, many of whom had families. This must have been a wonderful inspiration to Abijah, who'd been so isolated so many years, to think, perhaps I can do this too. Perhaps this is a life I can have. So he needed to do several things. He needed to be free, which he had just done. He needed to become a taxpayer, which he became in Northfield. And he needed to get on the polls to be able to own land when the divisions of property were made. And once he'd done that, he would be able to marry. This is a picture of Agrippa Hall. He was actually the son of one of the men in the Negro Network. Amos Hall was one of the most interesting people we ran across. And I won't tell you his long story now, but I like to show this picture because Agrippa became friends with the sons of Abijah and Lucy. And so we've got at least one picture of a black person who had known the Prince family at that time. Obviously, this is much later in his life. But I wanted to give you a sense of that. So Abijah got his Lucy. They got married. They lived in Deerfield, and they very quickly began to have children. Lucy was not free when they married, but she became free by the time their first child was born, somewhat under 9 months, but that's okay. And this is actually showing that Abijah went in and registered the births of his children at a time when births did not have to be registered. And no one was quite sure why he did that. We come up with two answers. One that David Proper came up with, which I think makes a lot of sense, which is that the Stamp Act was about to come in. And with the Stamp Act, everything that involved documentation and paper was going to be taxed by Britain. So that if you wanted any kind of legal documents done, you were going to have to pay. So he got himself in there very quickly and got them all registered. Another theory that I have is that slavery was everywhere. You know, it was in Massachusetts, it was in New York. The only place it wasn't was in Vermont, and Vermont wasn't really Vermont then, even though it ended up in the Constitution as not being allowed here. So that I'm sure that Abijah and Lucy wanted the world to be sure that their children were free children, that there could be no doubt about that. And these births were registered. I think that their son Caesar, who's the top one, was probably the first freeborn black person in Deerfield. He was born in 1757. They lived on some property that we think we have located, and they rented it from the Wells family. And to give you an idea of how comfortable and popular the Princes were in that area, you can see on here, I hope, that there's this brook that became known as Abijah's Brook. And that was bordering the property they lived on. And this map was, I think, nearly 100 years after they would have lived there, which means that for maybe a century, this land was still known by the fact that the Princes had been living on it, and this was Abijah's property. They didn't own this land, but they worked it for many, many years and raised their children there. And we think that they probably had a pretty good life in Deerfield. They worked very hard. Abijah had friends in town. We found references to him stopping at the end of the day into a tavern and having a glass of rum on his way home from work. He would be hired as a laborer by other farmers and people who worked in town, but we also found him hiring the slaves of other people to work for him on his farm property. And at first that seemed a very jarring idea And then you think about it and you think, well, these are men that he's always been working alongside all these years. Why would he not want to hire them to work for him? The problem, of course, is that their wages were not their own, and they were given to the slave masters. So there was a complicated Deerfield story in there. I want to kind of skip ahead, because it's a long story about how they got to Guilford. But in fact, they did get to Guilford, and they got 100 acres of wonderful land to work. All of it through Abijah's work. It was not given to him. And it's a complicated story that involves many, many looks at land records and transactions. But in fact, they ended up with this 100 acres. And we found a number of wonderful stories about them to just get an idea of how they fitted in. We know that they have some of their records were in the Guilford Church, so that they were either members of the church or well known by them, because Abijah's death is recorded in the church records. We don't know for sure that he belonged to the church. We never found a record of him belonging to any church ever. But we also know, and this is thanks to Anthony's really incredible sleuthing, that like many Vermonters, Abijah was pretty litigious. And people went to court with far more regularity than I ever imagined people went to court. If your neighbor owed you $2, you hauled them into court. If you wanted to get some property back that, that was taking too long to get returned to you, you took them to court. And Anthony found in the upstairs of the Newfane courthouse box after box after box of court records, all nibbled by mice and sitting up there, that would actually showed how often people were going to court. Now some of it's amusing, because you think, okay, why would you not just go next door and knock on the door and say, when can you give me that $2 back? But instead of going to court. But some of them were much more serious. We found, for instance, that 3 men were arrested for beating up the 2 youngest prince sons in Guilford. So there was not always a very pretty story going on. So there was a kind of backstory behind what we thought was a kind, comfortable place to live. And we found that, in fact, some really pretty dreadful things had been happening here. The big thing that happened here was that someone bought the land across the road from them and then coveted their land. And that was a man named Noyes. Some of you may know the Noyes family. There are Noyes everywhere now, and some of them various branches of the Noyes family. But in fact, he was hiring people to harass the princes, and that he would have them do things like break down their fences, set animals on the princes' crops so that they would eat the crops, and then some larger predations took place as well, as the children being beaten up. And at this point, Abijah and Lucy are pretty elderly, and it's really a terrifying story. Houghton Tavern is up here. This was at the end of the road where we used to live, and we discovered that that was actually the local court, where most of the local court cases took place. So the Justice of the Peace would be in there. So we found records of the princes going into Houghton's Tavern and having court cases being decided and for and against them. They tended to win, but not always. And so I wanted to show you that. Some of the things that we were trying to find out, the princes, could they read and write? Could they, what did they look like? These things that you could never find out. But in fact, the princes we were pretty certain could read and write. And this is Abijah's signature to a contract he had signed. He at least could write his name. Reading and writing were taught as separate skills in those days, so someone could read but not necessarily write. So someone might sign with an X, but it might not be that the person was not literate. He sometimes signed with an X, but sometimes he corrected people. We found contracts where they would write him down as Abijah Negro, and he would correct them, and then it would be Prince after that. So he was very certain about standing up for his rights, as was Lucy for hers. So that we see his signature on documents, and as well as that of his son, Caesar Prince. And we begin to realize that they were things, that they actually had a life that was pretty literate. If you go back to the Deerfield records, we were able to discover that there were lots of clues about that. For instance, Lucy bought primers twice, so we know that she was probably teaching her children at home. Abijah bought what was called a secretary's guide, and a secretary's guide was the big kind of encyclopedic book that taught you how to do everything, from drawing up a contract to grafting trees to, you know, everything that someone who would live in a remote area might need to know. So they had bought that. We found that he bought ink and inkwells, and that he bought a pair of eyeglasses. So that we're pretty certain that these were people who could read and write. And later even we found a page, Anthony found a page of an account book that Abijah kept here in Guilford. Things got really bad after a while, and Lucy was forced to go to court again one more time. And I always get the chronology wrong here. I know Anthony will correct me. But they had Lucy had taken herself finally up to see the governor and council, probably in company with a lawyer who she knew from around here. And she wanted to plead her case before the governor and council to get the Noyes family to stop attacking them and to stop, you know, coming onto their property. She waited up in Norwich for 5 days trying to be seen, and it was mostly because there wasn't a quorum that day or people didn't arrive and that sort of thing. And finally she was able to go in front and plead her case. And I can only imagine what this would have been like. The governor and council came in with great pomp. You know, they rode in on their horses. There was a militia that came in with them. There was great ceremony when they came into town to do this annual event. And there before them is Lucy Terry Prince, an African woman who is standing up to plead her case and ask for the protection of the state of Vermont. And she came home with what amounts to an order of protection, a cease and desist order that the town had to protect her because otherwise the Prince family would end up in charity and have to be taken care of. So they threw it back to the town to actually take care of them. When she got back, we thought this was going to be the end of it, but in fact there was an attack. And this was the really terrifying thing. That, and I think I got the chronology wrong, but Anthony will correct me, as he always does. That she comes back, and several hired thugs, hired by the Noyeses, are set upon the Princes. Lucy was at this time 60 years old, and Abijah was 85. Their children had not really grown up there. They had 2 daughters who were living with them, and these 2 younger sons who were living with them. The older sons had already moved away and actually really never lived in Vermont at all. They lived mostly in Massachusetts. So they were largely unprotected. They had a hired man named Scipio Smith, who was a mulatto from Northampton, and he was the one who was barring the door when the attackers showed up. They beat down the door. They beat up Scipio. We think that Abijah and Lucy escaped injury. The hayricks were set on fire, and the men took off. They had started this attack in Packer's Corner, so that we know that they were drinking at the tavern there before they set off for them. After they left the Prince property, they took off and went to Leiden. And in fact, after the attack, when the arrest warrants went out, because you know the Princes, being litigious, went straight after them and got arrest warrants for them. Some of them stayed in Leiden for a while to try to avoid being taken to court here. And I think all but one was prosecuted successfully in the end. So it was a long, frightening history of their time here. Lucy went to court, as I said, and then Abijah died at the age of 88. He was buried on their property, and then about 150 years later, a German immigrant bought the property and plowed under the grave and tossed away the headstone. So the grave can't be located today. There are stories of people who used to go by with great pride and say that's where one of the earliest pioneers of this, one of the earliest settlers of this area lived. People were very proud of the Princes. This was a story everyone in Guilford took great pride in, and he hadn't realized what he had done. After Abijah died, they moved on to Sunderland. He had gotten some property there many, many, many years before, and this was sort of the insurance for his family, so that they would have a place to live and land, because he'd actually sold the land before he died. They retained 5 acres, like a widow's parcel that they could live on, with the right for firewood and that sort of thing. But when he died, Lucy went to Sunderland with her rest of her family. This is actually from the church records in Guildford Church. 1794, January 19th, died Abijah Prince, aged 88 years. People lived a long time in those days. This is the land that Lucy thought was going to be hers. And she went out there with her sons to settle down in her old age and sort of think, okay, the fight is over, I can relax a little bit now. But instead, what they discovered was that a man named Eli Brownson had bought this land years and years and years before, having no idea that it had belonged to anyone else, and that these people would just suddenly show up. I guess you can imagine if you're a man who looks like him, pretty well off, living in Manchester at the time, and all of a sudden these black people ride into town with their belongings and settling down in land that you thought was yours. So he began to take them to court as well. So the court battles began all over again. And this time it took 8 years to settle the case. I won't go into all of the details, but we do know that Lucy did some of the arguing. We do know that they went to some of the major courts of the time, and that we do know how it ended up. And the way it finally ended up was that they ended up with a piece of property. If you can see right in here, this was the layout of the division of property in Sunderland at the time. And this lot right here, 42, has the word Negro written into it. So they called this the Negro lot. And on that lived Lucy, her son Caesar, her daughters Deruxa and Drusilla, and sometimes their son Festus. Festus had married a white woman, and he moved around quite a bit. He served in the military for many, many years. He was a fiddler and a drummer, and we think he was a musician. He put it down in the census that he was a musician. And he raised this family of mixed-race children. Not so unusual, I would think, in some places, not so common here as well. When the census takers would come around, they must have met his wife, also named Lucy, at the door, because they put her children down all as white. And then later, when Festus died, this Lucy and her children ended up living on the same Negro lot, and they became known as the White Negroes, and the town supported them. And I won't tell you how they supported everyone, but Lucy probably got a little weary, because finally in 1821, Lucy died, having been reputed to have made a trip back here every year on horseback to visit the grave of her husband and talk to him, and before going back west again, nearly blind, but reciting the whole Bible, and everybody in Sunderland knew Lucy. They knew her gift of gab. They would talk to her, and her funeral oration was delivered by Lemuel Haynes. And in the obituary, you can see just how strongly people felt about her and about how the kind of remarkable woman that she was. So I'm going to end by just saying, what does this tell us about New England? I think it tells us some really interesting and complicated stories about the time. 1821, well, we know that one of her daughters dies just before the Civil War. So we've actually got a story that begins right after, the 17th century, with Abijah being born in 1706. So it's not that far into the 18th century. That goes all the way up nearly to the Civil War with one family, always living in New England, always being very much a part of it, probably never going into the bigger cities, probably never visiting Boston or Philadelphia or New York, so that they had a life here still that was very much as New England settlers and farmers, very much like everybody else around them. At the same time that they lived a life that had begun in slavery, they ended with a life where they were still fighting for certain freedoms. But we also know, to complicate it a bit more, that the courts always took them seriously. They were always able to have a fair hearing. They were always able to be fairly heard when they went forward with their grievances. So it's a different kind of picture of New England. I think one that's really important for us to think about, because we think of ourselves, as I said, I did a a little commentary on All Things Considered a few weeks ago. I think Northerners, and particularly New Englanders, think that we get a pass in our history, because slavery was something that happened elsewhere. Well, it didn't just happen elsewhere, and there were also freedoms. So I don't think of this as a story about slavery. I think about this as a story of recovery of two incredibly remarkable people who lived right among us. And it's a wonderful thing to think that these are places that we walk these streets where they may well have walked and been known. And to recover them all these years later, I thought was, for both of us, a great honor for them. I'm sure you have questions, so I'm quite willing to answer anything. Yes?
Do you know precisely where their property was in relation to Packard Corners? I used to live in Packard Corners, so I've got a particular interest in. We thought they lived down that road someplace, but do you know exactly where?
I can only say that if I know where the property is, it is privately owned, and it is private property not to be revealed. I think that's as far as I can actually kind of legally go with that. Yes?
Well, that has me curious.
No, I mean, it's just that it's private property. Nobody wants, somebody who doesn't want people.
But it's in the land records.
No.
It's not.
Well, not in the, it takes some great deciphering.
Oh,
We know
okay.
Other questions that have not to do with their land? Yes?
The descendants of the princes, do you know anything about them now?
This is a question,
We'll get them off.
I get this question an awful lot. The princes had 5 grandchildren that we know of. 2 of them died as babies. There were 3 that were the children of Festus and his wife Lucy. Of those 3, one was a daughter who, if she married, which we assume she did, took another name, and we never found her again, because we don't have marriage records. Marriage records and birth records were not that common at that time. So of the 2 children that were left, the 2 prince sons, we think we may have found them, but we have not been able to trace them that far down. There is a theory that I think is probably fairly accurate, that because the 3 children were half white and half black, that they continued to marry into the white population. And over 200 years, they are probably white prince descendants living in Vermont and New York who may not realize that these were their ancestors. But there are not records that really tell us past that where they were. We've tried very, very, very hard. We're hoping somebody finds some journal in their attic and let us know. Yes?
One of the daughters had a psychiatric situation.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a tiny bit? Reading your book, I couldn't quite make out.
Well, the daughter Deruxa, this is a great mystery that we cannot solve. I've actually talked to neurologists. We talked to many experts in the writing of this book. I think if you look in the back and you see all those notes, you can see how many places and people we had to talk to. Somewhere around the age of 14, Deruxa suddenly became, in the words of those times, a lunatic. Now, I don't know what that means. It can mean anything. It could mean that she became quiet. It could mean that she began having seizures. I don't know what it means. One neurologist I spoke to said that some of these things can be hormonally related, and that 14 might have been a time where a trauma happened to her at that time that caused her some kind of mental breakdown. But we don't know. She remained insane for the rest of her life until the last 3 weeks of her life, where one day she woke up and remembered, and she was lucid again. And it was a remarkable story that Anthony managed to find, where she suddenly was, the sister you haul around with you everywhere you move, and then suddenly she wakes up and says, "What's for breakfast?" or something. And I can only imagine that last few weeks of her life must have been incredible, because her mother was dead at this point, and her sister Drusilla, Syl, and her brother Caesar were there, and they must have just talked a blue streak for 3 weeks to fill in everything that had happened over their years. And then at the end, on the last day of her life, she went for a walk, And then she climbed back in her bed and died. So, a remarkable find, though, to see that. I would love to know what happened. I talk about this book as being a story where a net is defined as string that holds together a series of holes, and then you're just trying to find the strings, and the holes you'll never be able to fill in. They're intriguing, though. Some more story? Questions? Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research methods and how you divided up what you were going to research. And sort of, did you have finding aids in the archives, or was it kind of a serendipitous, haphazard thing you came across?
Yes. There's really no easy answer to that question. Number one, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never done anything like this before. Gretchen taught me what she knew, and I'm not going to take anything away from your skills either, but I think delving into a lot of this old paper, which we had to do, was something neither one of us did. Gretchen was certainly academically more prepared, but I don't think she did either. There's a lot of trial and error, in all honesty. You don't have, one doesn't have, no, I screwed this.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
One doesn't have finding aids. There's a lot of serendipity. I mean, I'll not take anything away from myself. I got pretty good at this towards the end. In the beginning, I knew nothing, and in the beginning, a lot of it was just pure luck. And some of the luck revolves around what's left to be looked at. I'll give you 3 examples. In the case of Deerfield, the historian George Sheldon, which was his time period, like 1800s for Sheldon.
Yeah, he died after the Civil War.
Sheldon went around on Sundays when everyone else was at church, and he went to the various neighbors' houses that he knew, and he went to their attics when they were at church. And this is a story I believe it. If you ever research down in historic Deerfield, you'll see what they have, and you'll believe it too. Regardless, Sheldon was said to have gone into their attics and taken all their various account books and old family journals and letters for safekeeping and put them in wherever he put them, perhaps in his own basement. And they're all still there. And the luck of
Not
it,
his basement.
from our standpoint, no, they're in the library now. From our standpoint, the luck of it is that the princes spent 20 years at least of their lives in Deerfield, where all this stuff is preserved. Had they in fact spent those 20 years in Guilford, those early 20 years, maybe we wouldn't have a story, because, you know, much to my disappointment and shock to some extent, many of the early Guilford source materials are non-existent. The town records are virtually, well, I'll take that back, they're incomplete because of the York or Vermont difficulties that perhaps you're all aware of. And, you know, it turns out when you take old records, pieces of paper, contemporary records from those days, and bury them for safekeeping, it turns out that's not a very good way of preserving them. So a lot of the Guilford stuff is missing. So there's serendipity associated with where the subject of your research happened to be, and the luck of whether the stuff was preserved or not. So this is a roundabout answer. Yeah, there's a lot of luck involved. There are no finding aids. I can answer specific questions and give pointers, but there are no guidelines, no maps.
What I want to add to that is that it's a case of everything's written in 18th century script that's fading, in old ink. It's in old account books. It's in town meeting records. You find that town meeting records were not kept in chronological order. That sometimes they would begin a case or an issue, and then find another piece of paper 100 pages later, and they might continue an issue or a case. So that what you're doing is finding a little fact, and then you build a couple of other facts around it if you can, and you start just slowly building a story out of it that you understand. If this happened in this place at this time, this other thing is happening at that time, and you could begin to understand. So often it was just sometimes you would find something and then 6 months later you would find something else that made sense out of it. But we traveled much of Vermont. We traveled to a lot of town clerk offices. We traveled to major libraries, but everything was hard. You know, it becomes a real quest. I mean, it was just this determination to piece everything together. I was at it for 2 full years before Anthony kind of came into the project, and then he spent 5 full years doing this full time after that. And that's how long it took to really piece together everything that we were able to find. I don't know that you could do it for every person you ever want to look at. Some people may have things that we don't have, like, you know, if you find a subject who has letters, that would be really great. There are no letters. I've written several biographies, and never have I written one where there was never a letter written by the person you were working on. So the fact that the princes somehow came to us, I think, and helped us through this search, you know, really, I really do feel as though they've really inspired us in some way to make the story that people have been looking for 150 years finally sort of open up. But it wasn't easy, and most of it was not done on computers. Were there military records? Were there court cases? He was trying to do it by letter, back and forth with her and with the various archives that have those kinds of repositories. And then at the end, all of his notes, all of his letters back and forth, and all of that were there. One of the things I discovered in the Schomburg, though, that was very interesting was that when he finally thought he was at the end of his road, he was getting really frustrated because he couldn't find much. His son was going to take over, and he suddenly died and his son took over. His son couldn't get much further, so he decided to write the story as a juvenile novel. And he ended up just making up things, or, you know, taking historical things that he knew and putting the novel within that setting. So he, you know, but the Schomburg had then cataloged the story of Lucy in her bio, had taken all the information from that children's novel as fact. So if you go to the Schomburg and look up the finding aid, it'll say Lucy Terry was brought by the Lorenzo brothers from, you know, who were Portuguese slave traders, which they were, but they didn't have anything to do with Lucy. So that even a place like the Schomburg gets very confused. I kept referring to the stories like a story of, like a game of telephone, where somebody tells somebody something, and then we found that even descendants of people who had known the princes had mixed up the family history. Somebody who was convinced that Lucy had been a witness to the 1704 raid on Deerfield, which was 42 years before the raid that she's on. So of course he decided she died at 127 years old. So some of these stories get really mixed up, and it was really hard to untangle some of the things. Do you ever watch Antiques Roadshow and you hear all the things that people say, this ball was brought across from my father in Italy, and then they find out it was carnival glass from New Jersey or something? That's sort of what it was like sometimes. Any other questions? Yeah. Well, I'm sure they came into Brattleboro, but actually I think they did their shopping more likely nearer to Leiden. Isn't that what we kind of found, Anthony?
Yeah, where they live. I shouldn't talk about this. But where they live is actually very close to Massachusetts. And Leiden had town centers with shops. So I think they shopped down there. As long as I'm standing, let me just say one more thing. I was really frustrated by my inability to really add a lot of texture to their lives in Guilford, because I couldn't find anything to look at, right? In terms of source materials. I mean, their legal records, the legal records from Wyndham County are remarkably complete. And so our story for the
prince's lives here is a legal story. And, you know, the book is out, but if anybody knows anybody who has old Guilford connections and has old Guilford material, family letters, papers, account books, I'd love to look at them. So please get a hold of us. And I tried to do that when I was researching, but I came to nothing.
In your research, you have any reason to believe whether or not there were ever any slaves sold in Vermont?
Well, it's been talked about, you know that settlers of Vermont. Hello, can you hear me now? A lot of the settlers came from Connecticut, and so they brought black people with them. That's pretty well known. The only thing I personally encountered relating to Guilford, per se, was there was a Caesar in Guilford who was not a prince, and I found a legal record associated with him. And I know it wasn't Caesar Prince because it was Caesar, no last name. And the princes were very particular, as Gretchen said, about being first named and last named in recognition of their hard-won freedom. So there's at least one other black, and normally when a black person is referred to with no last name, it implies servitude. So I think there's probably a black slave in Guilford, probably.
Caesar is mentioned in the Guilford church records, but as being Caesar Prince, but it turns out actually not Caesar Prince. Caesar Prince didn't actually live here, and had actually married in Hadley and was living down there at that time. So he was not a member of the church here. So this is the other Caesar. We also found a person who had a black person who lived near the princes in Guilford for a time, named Danby, who also came from the same part of Connecticut that Abijah was born in. So we think there might have been some kind of connection because he also lived in Deerfield. Darby. Yeah, Darby. Yes.
Just in relation to Guilford and Brattleboro, I believe at that time Guilford was larger than Brattleboro.
It was. Yep. Yes, it was. We found lots of black people living in Vermont throughout the course of the research, and much of it was not here. The western part of the state had quite large black populations in St. Albans, around Jericho, and Middlebury had black people as well. We found the Prince's son living there for some time, so that there were pockets. Ethan Allen had 6 black men living on his property. We think they were working for him at that time. But of course, Vermont has built into its constitution this anti-slavery statement that's actually very ambiguous, but it's supposed to be saying that no slavery was allowed in Vermont, but I'm sure the early settlers were bringing people up with them. A lot of the early settlers were not wealthy people, so a lot of them were sort of hard-scrabble people just kind of eking out a living. This microphone is very frustrating, I apologize for it. Yes?
I hear that you had discovered some personal connection to someone's story?
Yeah. I wasn't going to tell that story, but I will. 2 years into the research, I had been, looking everywhere and trying to find this story. And one day I was putting together the story of the Doolittle family that Abijah had lived with. And I was looking through his genealogy. We'd found his history pretty easily from Connecticut. And then the story of his wife. He married a 20-year-old school teacher and brought her up to Northfield as well. And as I was looking through her family's story, I started seeing names that looked awfully familiar. My mother is a genealogist and has been a professional genealogist for some 40 years. And she has extensive, carefully non-computer found facts of our family history. And in fact, my ancestors were Tuttles, so I'm sure people in here who are my cousins in some way or other. But as I looked at these names, I said, oh my goodness, and I ran home to my mother and I said, get the books out, Mom. And as it turns out, it was my ancestral family that had been the owners of Abijah Prince. Could have knocked me over. At that point, I knew that's where the quest part of it began, when I realized it was not my direct ancestor. It was Lucy, the Lydia Todd, who married Doolittle. Her grandfather, they were brother and sister, was my family and hers. So it was the same family. So probably my ancestors knew Abijah. Probably saw him. They probably visited here or saw him when they went down to Connecticut. And at that point, the chase was on.
I think maybe we'll stop now because we want to give people a chance to purchase books, and perhaps you can talk to Gretchen at that.
Thank you.